On day 13, we'll establish the genre of our story. In order to do so, we'll continue to follow our three principles of clarity, diversity, and synergy. Now, why start defining genre since we are already 2 weeks in the process? You don't need a genre to start a story. You don't need a genre to start a book. Your genre and the elements you've already implemented in your story will develop as your story develops. Now, you may want to orient this story toward a particular genre or a particular frame already. And you have made choices in terms of characters, in terms of environments, in terms of settings, and in terms of storyline, which will already orient your story towards a particular genre. Selecting a genre on day one is not as useful as you may think. But to develop on that, let's try our classification, which is a simplified classification, in order to provide more clarity. We want this process, we want this formula to be truly systematic. Therefore, we have three main tools to use. So, clarity, diversity, and synergy. On the clarity part, you'll see quite quick that we have just limited our genre to a very small number. We'll function with 6 genres. We'll function with a maximum of 6 genres. Now, 6 may look limited to you, but you'll see how helpful it is really to have such a limited amount of genre. Now, what you may consider to be a genre may be treated later as a framework, and we'll explain in details what's the difference between genre and framework when we'll have to create a context in our story. Even if it may look counterintuitive, the fact of having a very limited amount of genre allows for more diversity in your stories, because now your stories are clearer for you, for yourself, and for the public. And the fact that the stories are clearer means you can choose more accurately, more deliberately, and therefore create a more diverse amount of story. The very fact that we have a limited amount of genre is also about the quality of synergy. Since you're developing a more accurate, a clearer, a more deliberate diversity, you will be able to establish the links, the bond between your story more easily. Here's our first layer of genre. So now we'll treat them as 4 distinct entities. And we meant entities here because you want to anthropomorphize your genres as well, in order to make them more vivid, in order to make your stories more vivid. Now, we have these 4 genres, and they're supposed to act in synergy. The arrow you may see on the schema, the cycle represented here, is one of the flux you can follow. It's one of the senses you can follow. But you don't have to follow this schema clockwise only. You can go from action to adventure to drama, back to action to horror to adventure, and so forth. You choose the flow you want to follow. Now we'll just present it to you with this very simple clockwise based genre system. So our first genre is action. Action will be one of the most useful genre if you're starting, because action will basically be the genre of your combat phases, your combat scenes, your fights, your arguments, your competitions. Now, what's the purpose of action? It's difficult to answer what's the purpose of action, but it's quite easy to answer what are the dominant emotions found in action. And that's why it will be our go-to formula here. We're gonna look for the main emotions you want to transcribe through your story. So, a specific genre may be more appropriate to your story if you need these emotions. So in the case of action, we've chosen to present you courage and anger. Here this way. Courage and anger are the two main emotions that we chose to pick here. But you can have other emotions linked to action, which will be main or secondary emotions. For example, we could have added rage. We could have added other emotions which follow the idea of action, which fall into the semantic field of courage and anger. Now, why is action placed here in the top right corner? Because action is placed between horror and adventure. So you may imagine, first, action is opposed directly to drama, but also action serves as a transition from horror to adventure. And you'd be right. Thing is, if you want to transition from action to adventure, in fact, you'll transition from one main emotion to another emotion. And as you transition from anger to excitement here, you'll transition from a combat phase, for example, to an exploration phase, an exploration scene, the discovery of a new environment, or the rediscovery of an environment you know already, but you might discover under a new layer with new elements. So, going through action to adventure is really only passing from anger to excitement. Here you have the perspective of your characters. You have the state of mind they should have in one scene to the next, in order to show clearly to the public, but also to the other characters, how they're meant to evolve. Same goes from adventure to drama. You discovered this new land, you discover these new possibilities, and now you're in wonder. As wonder goes, as wonder falter into exaltation, you start to realize that this new land, that these new possibilities are not as appealing as they first appeared. And now you'll feel this feeling of sadness. So that's the transition between adventure and drama. And then, same thing. As sadness grows and turns to bitterness, you start to feel angst in you. Anger returns in the form of fear. Because we consider angst in this course as the combination of anger and fear, but more on that later. The fact that you have this smooth transition from one emotion to the next, which again is simplified here. It's extremely simplified in this clockwise sense, but the thing that in most situations it will apply. Even if you wanted to go from sadness to disgust, for example, or if you wanted to go from sadness to there are multiple possibilities of transition. In fact, you can imagine that when you pass from one genre to the next, you have at least 3 possibilities. If you want to transition from action to adventure, imagine that you'll transition from anger to possibly 3 other types of emotion. And these 3 other types of emotion will represent 3 different types of character or 3 different types of reaction. The final transition in this cycle is the transition from fear to courage, once more. Now you want to consider this. Your story may not include all of these genres, because your story will have at least one dominant genre or maybe 2, and really we'll recommend that you pick maximum 1 or 2 main genre and then left the other 2 minor scenes. Your story may have, for example, horror and drama as main genre, and so therefore it will not allow much action to be fit in your story. Now, you can have a little bit of action, a little bit of adventure, but your main genres will be horror and drama. And really, if you're beginning, we highly recommend that you follow this principle. If you're more advanced, you know already that you're able to mix and match genre a lot more, and you have a lot of flexibility. But when you're a beginner, improvising on the storyline part, on the story part, on the genre, for example, or contextualization part is difficult. So we recommend that you pick 1 to 2 main genre. And well, if you're a beginner, we'll highly recommend that you go for action adventure. But again, that's a matter of your taste and your choices here. So you may want, for example, to go for adventure plus drama. But either way, focus on 2 main genres. Focus on 1 to 2 genre. It will allow you to create more diversity between your stories. Think about it this way. The fact that you're limiting yourself, the fact that you're focusing on a specific context, allow you to create more diverse story. So if you've already planned, because you're really enthusiastic about this project, if you've already planned to write something like 5 books the following year, or maybe a trilogy or quadrilogy or a series of 5 to 6 books in the coming 12 months, you may want to focus for each of these stories. If you have, for example, 4 books, you may want to have 1 book focused on action, 1 book focused on adventure, 1 book focused on drama, and 1 book focused on horror. This will ensure more diversity. And if you go through this simple transition from action to adventure, from adventure to drama, from drama to horror, you have this smooth synergy between your book, and you're able to create a cycle of emotion. If you're engaging, for example, yourself in a character's journey, for example, if you keep your same main characters for your whole series, you can see your character evolve, from shock to maybe denial to excitement and courage, to sadness and realization, and to finally acceptance of their fate, before starting again a new cycle of enticement, maybe motivated not by anger this time, but by courage. And then from courage goes a wonder, because you found these new possibilities, and so on. You create a better continuity in your stories by focusing your story on 1 main theme and then other 4 themes. And this main theme will most of the time linked to 1 genre, 1 set of emotion. Now, if you had 2 things to remember from this episode: focus on 1 genre to develop the diversity and the synergy of your stories, and pick this genre to be aligned with the theme, the main theme of your story. It may sound paradoxical, but we want you to try as many genres as possible. But that also means that we don't want you to try as many genres as possible in 1 story, because it will be confusing for you, especially if you're starting now. We want you to try as many genres as possible, meaning we want you to write as many stories as possible by focusing your effort on 1 genre, on 1 theme, on 1 action, on 1 adventure. We'll extend our system by adding 2 new genres. This system, as all systems we propose you, as all procedures we propose you, is meant to remain as simple as possible. It is why 6 genres is the highest level of complexity we'll present to you. Now, mind that we'll have to combine these 6 genres with multiple frameworks. And those frameworks will include Western, mystery, crime, thriller. There will be multiple frameworks that we will combine with this genre in order to create contexts later and create even more complex stories. But for now, let's keep in mind the two main rules that we had from the last episode. For each story you're writing, focus on 1 to 2 main genres, and once you've chosen this genre, you want to make sure that they follow the emotions you want to display, the emotions you want to treat in your stories, and the themes linked to these emotions. So, to summarize, pick your emotions first, and then use the corresponding genres in your story as a whole, in a chapter, and in a scene. The same rule applies to each of these 3 scales. Now, let's go through our cycle of genres again. We start with action. Now, action, here, the beginning, is the result of anger. No, the emotion you want your character to feel, the emotion you want your public to feel is anger in this very scene, and in this very action scene. Then from action, from anger, you'll transition to relief and enter the domain of comedy. Now, what comes from comedy as well as relief? Well, confusion may come from comedy, since comedy is the genre which is most based on paradoxes. You'll have paradoxes to treat in every genre, because as soon as you have a theme to treat, as soon as you have to balance maybe 2 themes together, there may be some form of paradox. And as a general rule of thumb, anywhere where you can find a synergy between 2 concepts, you can find a corresponding paradox between these 2 concepts. It's just a matter of balance. Now, this confusion may come from or go to excitement, and then you get into the domain of adventure. From adventure, again, you've been excited. Now you're starting to discover this new world, and wonder opens to you. Wonder is the door to exaltation. Through exaltation, you have to realize that what you've envisioned at first as a new possibility, a new choice, a new chance maybe, may not be as satisfying as you imagined at first. So you transition from this new zone, this new sphere, drama, to a new sphere. From sadness comes contemplation, and this contemplation will allow you to think more, to envision more, to consider more choices. Now, excitement is past, sadness is past, you can start to think. But as you think, you solicit memories, and memories may lead you to rancor. Rancor may lead you to fear. And then again, from fear, you return to courage. That's your cycle here. So it's more complex because now, instead of 8 emotions, we have 12. We have 4 new emotions that you can... And now, realize that all these numbers we're using since the beginning, 4, 6, 8, 12, and later we'll see 16. So these numbers, 4, 6, 8, 12, they're the same numbers each time because we really want it to feel like a system. It has to be systematic. So when you're creating your characters, when you're creating your settings, your environment, you want to create them through this prism, through this filter of numbering. For example, you have 4 main characters. Okay, maybe you have a character which represents action, one character which represents adventure, one character which represents drama, and one character which represents horror. Now, one of these 4 characters will be your main character. And so your main character will be linked to your main genre. For example, here, since the beginning, we're admitting that red is the main, it's a rival, and it's the protagonist. So action is our main genre here. But let's consider you want to treat it another way. Let's consider we have green as our main character. Now, if you transition from red to green, let's figure out that maybe as our story has advanced, red has perished, and now green has to be the new protagonist. So, is our new main genre adventure? Yeah, maybe, because the transition from action and adventure is pretty straightforward here. Now, same thing for drama. If you choose that the character in blue is your main character, or maybe you choose that your antagonist becomes the protagonist later, you can transition from action to drama. It's a little bit more advanced, but it's completely possible, and here you may want to experiment that. You really may. You may want to experiment that maybe in your second story or your third story. Again, same thing, it's the same thing every time. If you want to make more difficult experiences, more advanced experiences, just first write your first book, write your first story, make it as easy as possible, make it as enjoyable as possible for yourself, and then, since you're satisfied with this first story, with this first book, you'll want to do it again, and you do it again in your second book, in your third book, and in the second and the third book, you try more things. You may want to try a horror character as the main character, and horror as your main genre. Now, once you've tried that, what's left for you? Well, let's suppose you've written 4 books. You've written your 4 main stories already. Okay, now you tried action, you tried adventure, you tried drama, and you tried horror. You get this group of characters you really enjoy, you're attached to, and you hope the public will be attached to them. And really, you've engineered them, you've designed them for the public to be attached to them. So there's a high chance that they are. Let's suppose we want to go for something a little bit more complex. Now, you don't have 4 characters anymore, 4 main characters, but you have 6 main characters. And now that will be a more advanced lesson for this part. So if you're planning to do that, try that on your second story. Let's suppose now you're functioning not with just 4 mains, but 6 mains. And your 6 main characters will all represent a different genre in their behavior, in their goal, in their quirks, because all of these genres have a quirk associated to them. For example, your horror character may behave in a very alien manner. She may be maybe taller or more slender than the other, or thicker, depending on which kind of impression you want to create. Your action character may be more brawny, she may be more muscular, more athletic than the other. And so can be the adventure character. And maybe she's an adventure character, maybe she's smaller than the action character, maybe she's more dexterous, more agile, stealthier, maybe even, you don't know. If you have a comedy character, same remark as for the adventure character. Maybe you want a more childish character because they're supposed to impersonate this genre, but this genre is impersonated through the emotion it suscitates. So now, if you want to start writing a story with 6 characters, or you could do it with your actual story. You already have your 4 main characters and you want to add 2 secondary characters, for example, because you don't need to start now with 6 characters. maybe it may feel a little overwhelming as you're 2 weeks into the process. But you can always add 2 new secondary characters, 2 characters that are less important than your main 4, but that will still allow you to create attachment with the public. So let's suppose you want to go through that. You want to make your character the representation of your genre. What is the essence of each of these genres? We'll consider that action, the genre, and therefore the emotions of courage and anger are driven by pride. Pride is the main factor when it comes to action, and concepts like honor, courage, competition, all these concepts are driven by pride. Now, pride may be a dominant factor in horror and comedy as well, since they're adjacent to action. But pride will be the main drive of action for now. So the same logic applies to all of these genres. You have a little bit of joy in action, and you have a little bit of hatred maybe in action too. Now for comedy, the driving factor of comedy will be joy. Joy will be the driving force of comedy. It will be the essence of comedy. It will be the reason why comedy began. Now you may argue that comedy's essence, comedy's sole essence is not joy. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And that's not what we meant. Comedy's main force is joy. And so we have adjacent forces. We have pride here, and we have amity, as we'll see in adventure. But comedy might be driven by pondering as well. It's a little more distant, and most of the time you'll see that most comedy doesn't aim at making the public and the characters ponder. But that's absolutely a possibility, because each of these 6 genres interacts with the others. And therefore, each of the 6 driving factors is applicable to all genres, just to a different degree. Now, if we transition from comedy to adventure, the driving force of an adventure type character, of a green character here, is amity. Now, you want to consider that these driving forces, so you can read amity here for adventure, are built based on the 2 genres that are adjacent, but they're built according to the opposites also. So the opposite here of adventure is horror. In this system, the genre which is considered to be mirroring adventure, the antipode of adventure is horror. Because if horror is oppression, adventure is freedom. See, horror is oppression here, so adventure is freedom. Horror is hatred, adventure is amity. Now, that's how you want to consider the relationship between these genres, the relationship between the characters that are impersonating this genre, the driving concepts here. Okay, again, amity, hatred, freedom, oppression. And it works exactly the same way for drama and action. So the driving force of action is pride. Pride. My law, my rule is true. My rule, my law will stand, and it will propagate. That's pride. See? You're a dictator in your own mind. Now, what's the driving force of drama? It's pondering. pondering. This rule I had in me, this law which I thought was absolute, has been now degraded by the events. This rule, this principle I thought was applicable in every situation was not applicable in this situation. No, there is a shock, there is a pain here. And this pain has made me reconsider that my perspective, that the rule I thought were true, weren't as universal as I first thought. No, so if action commands rigidity, if action is more rigid, drama is supposed to make your characters more flexible. No, opposition in the concept, direct opposition in the concept. Now you have to understand why those are the core of it. A character is meant to be rigid in an action context because it demands immediate reaction, it demands fast reaction, it demands anger, it demands courage, it demands pride, it demands an attack, it demands you to defend yourself against a threat. So that's generally the context will be in when it will come to crisis. Now drama, you have crisis in drama because that's the factor that will generate the thinking. Drama and sadness increase your intelligence, but they increase it post-crisis, not during the crisis. So post-crisis, you'll have a moment of comfort, and comfort allows you to think more. Comfort provides a shelter. Comfort allows more effort. And so in this comfortable situation, you won't need to react as fast because now you're not threatened anymore. And you'll be able to revise your thinking, ponder, think about the element that made you sad, and envision again a new possibility, contemplate. Now, the same thing applies to the last two elements, to the last two colors here, gold and indigo. But let's get back a little bit to horror and adventure. So now, the keywords chosen to keep for horror and adventure were oppression and freedom. And what does that mean in terms of characters? So now, you have to realize that freedom, as we presented our roles until now, will often correspond to one role. The concept of freedom, the concept of adventure will be tied to the role of enticer. An enticer is enthusiastic, an enticer is fervid, an enticer wants to discover the world, an enticer is open-minded, her mind is global, it's open to the outside. Whereas, on the other hand, oppression, and that's not necessarily always true, but that's how it will be perceived by the public at least, or perceived by many characters. The oppression is often tied to the role of arbiter. An arbiter is equitable, an arbiter is detached, but to some extent, an arbiter is absolute. And so, by her absolute nature, the arbiter will be a source of oppression. So we have these four roles, and you can apply the very same logic for the other two roles. Action, rival, action, relentless, reckless, self-rigid, immediate action, immediate reaction, facing the threat. Drama, advisor, empathetic, attached, thoughtful, pondering, more reflexive, more flexible. Rival, action, drama, advisor, adventure enticer, horror arbiter. No, that's really the caveat. It really has to be systematic. All that we present to you, we want it to be tightly linked. No, we want it to be as easy as possible for you. So you have a corresponding rule for each of your genre. You can attach them just like that. You can apply it just like that. You can, of course, also not applying like that. You can choose that. Yeah, okay, I'm writing action. I'm writing something that, I want it to be action, but at the same time, I want my main character to be an enticer. So your character is mainly an enticer and a little bit of a rival, for example. Or I'm writing adventure drama. So my character is mainly an advisor. She's mainly meant to be empathetic and attached, but she's also a bit enthusiastic, In her days of comfort, when she's in a comfortable situation, when she discovers the world, she's enthusiastic, she is ecstatic, she is exalted. Because remember, you have a transition between all your genre. So you have a transition between all your roles, you have a transition between all your characters, you have a transition between your environment. So that leaves you a lot of room for flexibility. But if you want more safety, all has been provided to be tightly shot. So now let's finish on our two new genres. So there are no rules for now. They exist, but we deliberately choose not to present them to you right now. There are no rules for now that correspond directly to comedy and saga. But you can imagine that in the case of comedy, since comedy is in the middle of action and adventure, you can consider that comedy, to some extent, is a combination of some factor in action and some factors in adventure. So if you want to create a character which would be a comedy type of character, you have to combine the role of rival and the role of enticer. And it doesn't have to be a 50-50 split. You can make it 2/3 of a rival and 1/3 of an enticer, or the other way around. You also have the possibility to create a pair of a main character. Now you'll decide that your protagonist is in fact two characters. The protagonist, the character you want to follow through the whole story, the character you want to follow the perspective, the point of view through the whole story, is in fact a pair of character. The public will attach herself to a pair of characters. And this pair, by drawing the action factor, the rival factor, and the adventure factor, the enticer factor in herself, the synergy between these two characters will create the comedy. So maybe the rival character is the straight character, the serious character, whereas the adventure character, the enticer, is the jokester character, which make, jokes. And the situation, the synergy between these two characters will create the heart of your comedy. Same goes on the other side. If you don't have a saga role, because you don't have a saga role for now, but you want to create a saga, you may want to combine a horror character and a drama character. So an arbiter and an advisor. And now you'll see the complementarity between these two roles. Since the advisor is the flexible one and the arbiter is the rigid one, there's a balance between established, One of them will start to design rules, the arbiter will design rules, and the advisor will contradict them by facts, by events, by all the crises, all the issues that will happen to the pair of characters. These two characters will experiment a saga. Now, for saga, maybe the most remote genre here. Saga is characterized by two main emotions. So you go from sadness to contemplation, and you go from remembrance to rancor. So that's one way, but you can go from rancor to remembrance, remembrance to contemplation, contemplation to sadness. You can function the other way around. And you can also easily transition from remembrance to relief, and from contemplation to confusion, because the transition between saga and comedy is absolutely possible, since they are opposite genre, they are complementary. Now let's refocus on the saga genre. The driving factor, the driving force of a saga is not a common emotion. It's not like pride, joy, amity, pondering or thinking, and hatred. It's an uncommon emotion, and it's maybe the most important emotion here because it's the goal of this course. It's the goal of your stories. The driving force of saga is attachment. Now, what does it mean for you? We'll have a course later on fables, saga, and how to create attachment. But as an introduction to this future course, so hear this point. If you don't know, because this is a course on genre, and we haven't still answered one essential question. How do you start? How do you write if you don't know which genre pick? Now for you. If you don't know which genre you should pick, if you're not sure which genre you're writing, if you're unsure of which genre should be your definitive genre or the genre of your series, go for a saga. Because the driving force of a saga is the goal of all of your stories. And if I say it otherwise, in the end, if you tend to really love that, if you tend to write 10 books, 15 books, 20 books, in the end it will be a saga. In the end it will be a series. It will be a long series, whichever genre you're choosing, So saga will be the go-to option. If you don't know which genre to pick, go for a saga. Go for the contemplation. Go for the remembrance. Go for the attachment. Now, from all we said since the beginning, you may have understood that saga, since it's placed right here between horror and drama, it's not only placed between horror and drama, it's also placed right in the middle of action and adventure. And you may see, if you have a more geometric approach, you may realize that there's a triangle here formed by these three genres. Because originally, before we call this genre saga, a saga at its core is action adventure. That's what a saga is. If you want to write a saga, you'll write an epic, an action adventure, and then you'll add elements of horror, you'll add elements of drama, and you'll have elements of comedy. So now, how do you write a saga if you intend to plan it for the long run? If you know by now that's what you want to do, you want to write stories, you're driven by it. Start with 4 simple books, very, very simple books, and try action, try adventure, try drama, and try horror in your 4 first books. Once you have these 4 first books, you have enough material to restart again. So write a comedy book. It will be your 5th book, because you may not realize it, but comedy is a little bit more advanced than the other 4 genres. It's quite difficult to write a good comedy. And your 6th book will be the conclusion of this first series of book. It will be a saga. But this saga, it will not only be the 6th book, it will be all the books, you know? Since I'm gonna go for 0. You know, this saga will not only be your 6th book, it will be your 0th book as well. And what do we mean by 0th book? Well, 0th here is the sum of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, up to the 6th one. You know, your saga, this series of books you've written, will be both the last book, the 6th book, and the sum of all your books. That will be your first saga. So that's our long answer to one of the most important questions of this course. If I don't know which genre to pick first, pick a saga. Pick saga. You know, start with an action book maybe, or an adventure book, or whichever genre. Then you write a 2nd book, different genre. 3rd book, different genre. 4th book, different genre. 5th book, comedy, most likely. Perhaps you have some affinity with comedy, you love comedies, you're watching a lot of them, and it will be a lot more easier for you to write it earlier, but most likely it will be your 5th book, and your 6th book will be your saga. And so will be the sum of all these 6 books you've written.